This is your host, Srini K. I'm a senior principal based out of Dallas, Texas, working with Infosys, which is a leading multinational corporation that provides business consulting, IT, and outsourcing service. So we are going to have this 3-session webinar series titled Think Simple, Stay Focused, Supply Chain Reimagined with Demand-Driven Principles. So we'll be taking a closer look at DDMRP, Demand-Driven Materials Requirements Planning. So as someone rightly said, supply chain is all about building stuff to finally sell that stuff, and everything in between is delayed and is full of risk. So most of which is unspecified, unidentified, unquantified. So as a avid supply chain practitioner and a technology enthusiast for the last 2 decades, I've been part of several intriguing customer engagement stories around reimagining supply chains. So times of today have put a renewed spotlight on supply chains, and a lot of supply chain playbooks are being rewritten, and due to a host of structural changes in context of the uncertainties we live in, a drive to cost optimize all the components of supply chain, and a slew of innovations in this space. So one such innovation happens to be DDMRP, which is what we're going to talk about today. And in this regard, we have with us today 2 distinguished guests, Carol Ptak from Phoenix, Arizona, and Stephen Montgomery from Sydney, Australia. So welcome, Carol and Steve. Yeah, so Carol is a leading supply chain thought leader, co-author of business novel Necessary But Not Sufficient, that delves into theory of constraints. She is now a co-founder of Demand Driven Institute, and which happens to be a global authority on DDMRP. And what she brings to the table is her deep experience and learnings in the area of supply chain. And we will get to know from her how DDMRP is essentially redefining planning. And also joining us today is Stephen Montgomery, and he's the demand-driven practice lead at Infosys Portland, which is the strategic consulting division within Infosys. So Steve has been part of a multiple supply chain related successful demand-driven implementations globally, and he brings a very pragmatic view from industry. Having run a supply chain himself, Steve will share some of his hands-on implementation experience with us today. So welcome to the show, Steve, as well. Over the next 3 sessions, what we are going to do is we will deep dive into some major trends in supply chain. So we will try to understand how DDMRP can potentially help organizations reshape their supply chain strategy and manage the risks which comes with the disruptions today. So just to also add, Infosys recently qualified to be a global affiliate to DDI, and it inked a very important partnership to further its presence in DDMRP competency. So better serve our customers, especially in the area of supply chain planning. So that's it. Let us jump straight into our discussion. And the first session is called Back to Basics. So thanks, Carol and Stephen, for taking time for this session. For first things first, what are some major disruptions, Carol, that you're seeing in supply chains today that will totally redefine how we do and manage planning?
Well, I think probably the biggest one is, what has ever been in everybody's face, which of course is the COVID-19 pandemic. But the reality is, we've faced crises like this before. Harvard wrote several years ago a great paper on risks in the VUCA world, and they named 6 risks. What's interesting about the pandemic that we're going through right now is there's a chain reaction of these risks. One of the risks is what's called the fat tail risk, which is pretty rare, but it's a major shock that runs through the system. And we've seen pandemics before. Remember the SARS crisis in Toronto. Remember the swine flu. We've had 9/11. So these things come up about every 10 years. So the thing that we know is these risks are going to pop up. What we don't know is where and exactly when and exactly what that risk is going to be. What made the pandemic really interesting is here's a fat tail risk that set off a chain reaction of some of the other risks, the collapse. We saw change coming from outside of companies, just totally disrupting companies. We saw discontinuity risks that all of a sudden companies, had to pivot, had to stop doing what they were doing and all of a sudden do something different, which, nobody before had ever been able to see. obsolescence risk. I mean, think about the changing consumer needs that have been just going on. My last trip, as COVID was starting to unfurl itself around the world, I came in from Colombia, stopped at the local grocery store on my way home, and was shocked to see here I was in the United States. No meat, no produce, no toilet paper, of course, no cleaning supplies, and those shelves would remain empty for quite some time. I think the biggest thing that we're seeing today that's really causing us to focus on supply chain is that I've spent 40 years in this industry, and I've always had to explain what supply chain management is. Now, when I watch the local news at night, in about 15 minutes, they've mentioned supply chain 20 or 30 times. So I don't have to explain what supply chain is anymore. People get it. And so it's a very interesting thing that executives, they're really starting to wake up and saying, you know what? There isn't going to be a post-COVID time. We're in it. So how do I adapt my business to be able to this new normal that we're in?
Exactly. Supply chain has become part of our daily vernacular now, and I get to see everyone from Wall Street to Main Street, everybody using this word supply chain in almost every day now. It's becoming a frequently used term as per what I'm seeing in television today. So moving on, in a very simplistic way, Carol, if you could explain to us and dumb down the concept of DDMRP, help us kind of understand why it has become a very compelling proposition in today's world in planning.
Well, really, because it is simple. It's easy to dumb it down because it's already very simple. It's something that as a planner and as a manager of an operation or supply chain, we already have an intuition about how to best run our facility. What we know is that the number one problem that we are trying to manage is the bullwhip effect, system nervousness. I mean, when I first joined the Apex organization some 40 years ago, the very first dinner meeting that I went to was about system nervousness and how to mitigate it. Well, we get sort of caught up in this whole thing of the computers had to be faster, and if only we could calculate in real time, we could calculate in memory, that all of our problems would be solved. Well, that was because we were sort of trapped in this idea that MRP was run once a week. What we didn't see is that the faster we got, the worse things got. And so you had to take a step back and say, hold it, what should we really be focused on? And where we have been traditionally focused on cost, what demand-driven very simply is it shifts the focus of supply chain management to flow. So that's really what it's all about. Well, how do you get flow? Well, flow, the number one enemy of flow is variability. Well, how do you stop variability? As you mentioned in the introduction, I'm in Arizona, and right now we're in the middle of horrible fires. These wildfires are all around me. And so how do you stop a fire? Well, if I'm in a building, I stop it with firewalls. In a supply chain, I stop that variability with what we call decoupling points, positions of independence that allow us to stop that variability so that it doesn't get worse and worse. In my town where I'm at right now, they've just had 3 wildfires merge into one. So we've got this conflagration going on because these fires feed each other. So in supply chain, what we have to do is very simply stop the variability, stop the bullwhip effect. And how we do that is to understand that supply chains are strategic for a company to achieve its competitive advantage. It's not just those people out in production and operations that do that stuff. It really is something that's important in the C-suite, that we need to design and run our supply chains such that we can sense changes in our marketplaces, adapt to what's going on in that marketplace through our planning and production, and then innovate. Allow us to change faster than our markets change. So very simply, that's what demand-driven is. It's all about flow.
Right. So it's all about bursting the bullwhip bubble is another way I can put it. Right?
That's exactly right. Stop the bullwhip.
Yep. So given all this background and context, Steve, I would like to know from you, you have experience both in the traditional planning as well as demand-driven planning. So can you share some insights into how planners take to demand-driven versus traditional planning?
Well, Srini, most plan, pretty much every planner I've met takes to it like a duck does to water. It's so intuitive and so clear for them that we get very high degrees of adoption. And planners are never the ones who push back in these demand-driven programs. And the reason for that is that planners are really starved for relevant information. They're the ham in the sandwich, proverbially, and they've got all this noise coming up at them. People upstream and downstream of them are incentivized to make each of their independent silos better. And what demand-driven really does is it cuts out this noise through these buffers. And then a step on from that is that we start to get very clear signals. And that's driven out of cutting out the noise between forecast versus sales order differences, things like backward and forward consumption, and the impact of that in our inventory calculations, and then that variability amplification that's coming through on the bullwhip effect. So planners really work and they see very clear signals. They see a prioritized list of what they need to work on, and they invariably action that, review that, and then head for coffee. They come back, they look at points of overstock or oversupply. That's very C. We talk about blue items or overstocked items. They head out for lunch. They come back for their afternoon session, and invariably we see a lot of really tangible simulations running. They model and simulate, and the key here is that it's all done in a roughly right manner. We go off and we adjust tangible and very, very tangible and very practical things within our supply chain, and we head out to go spend time with our families. So planner morale specifically really, really increases, and we get a lot of good buy-in from that.
That's a great insight, Steve. So, Carol, in that context, do you see specific supply chain setups where you find DDMRP works better than others? Any specific verticals where you see adoption rate being higher for DDMRP?
Well, that's probably one of the most common questions that we get is, where does it work? Where doesn't it work? Well, first, let's talk about what it is. We talk a lot about demand-driven. It's really it's simple. It's 5 simple steps. And the first one Steve already talked about, which is, where do I position these strategic buffers? That's strategic decoupling. That's a strategic decision, because that determines our customer lead time and our inventory investment. Second is then, how much buffer do I need there to provide to be able to stop that bullet? The third is, how do I dynamically adjust those so that I can adapt to what's going on in the marketplace? Well, think about those first 3 steps: positioning, sizing, and dynamic adjustments. That means that this whole process has really been designed for a very volatile, variable world. So what I always tell people in answer to that question is that the one environment where demand-driven does not work, DDMRP does not work, and don't waste your time, is if you're living in a perfect world with no variability, no volatility, no uncertainty, no complexity, and no ambiguity. Now, at that point, I love the look on your face, Srini, because you're like, really? Who's living there, right? Well, so that means that if it's designed for this VUCA world, then the more VUCA you have, then the better it works. So not surprisingly, the industries where mostly it's been applied is a lot of consumer products, fast-moving consumer goods, CPG, but also we have a lot of implementations in companies like Emerson out of France that were engineered to order. Because each company's supply chain is different, which means that those first 3 steps, that inventory positioning, the sizing, and the dynamic adjustment, is going to be different for every supply chain. But what is common for all of them is that variability, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
Right. It's a great insight that you have provided, Carol.
It doesn't seem like variability is going to go away anytime soon. So, and the companies that can sense and adapt to what's going on in the marketplace are going to be the ones that are going to survive. It's been very interesting conversation with a number of our affiliates and companies that have implemented around the world. Absolutely shocked as the pandemic started to really gain momentum. and they would call me and they'd say, the buffers are holding. And we always have a saying is never underestimate the power of a buffer to absorb variability, because that's what it's for.
Exactly. And I think we will continue to see these kind of supply chain disruptions just like COVID. I mean, this has become like a part and parcel of life now. So, on that context, how should organizations actually prepare themselves for a DDMRP transformation? So, any kind of typical mindset changes that one would need to do where you see that DDMRP gets adopted better? Do they really need to unlearn some practices, good or bad, however it may be, that they are deeply invested in today? Carol?
The number one thing is education. Invest in the thought work for your people. The most valuable asset a company has is its people. And the most difficult barrier to jump over is right here, is we call thought work. Is getting that into your head of focusing on flow, because it is such a big step. It affects so many things in the company. The journey starts with DDMRP. DDMRP is just the starting point, but it's the starting point of a much larger journey. And that first step is starting to think about flow. So it's all about education. I met with one executive in a company and he said, well, we tried DDMRP pilot and it failed. And I said, oh, really? So tell me a little bit more about your pilot. Did you put your people through education? No, we didn't educate anyone. Okay. Did you buy the book? Did you read the book? Maybe you self-studied, because we've had that happen. No, we didn't read the book. Well, then what did you think you did? Well, we wrote a couple things on the website. No, education. We've got to get people to understand that demand-driven really solves the problems that we as planners, like Steve, I've been planning for many, many years, that we've been facing for a very, very long time. And it makes the pain go away so that we can go spend time with their families and have a real life.
That makes perfect sense, actually. I mean, people are the most important asset that an organization can have. And I think that is where companies typically tend to overlook in any big transformation exercise. So, Steve, from your experience, what have been some of the key learnings while implementing DDMRP?
Yeah, so Srini, I just want to reiterate that point Carol made so clearly, is education. It just cannot be overstated enough. What we see within some of our implementations is that sometimes this is the first time that planners are taking the demand-driven planner or the demand-driven leader course for the first time in a decade. And you just start to think about how much the supply chains have moved, progressed, and changed in the last 5 to 10 years. It's a world away from what we were used to. The other key learnings for me is just around senior leadership buy-in. I've seen these programs come bottom up, and they succeed. We've seen lots of results come through from the bottom. But really, if you're serious about this and you get into it, when there's senior leadership buy-in and the C-suite is on board with this demand-driven and flow-based model, it's unbelievably powerful when the CEO is walking around and saying, we're going to this, I believe this, I understand that this solves the bullwhip effect, that this deals with a dynamic, high variability, volatility type environment that we experience. And I think the last component is around identifying and building up an internal champion. Many demand-driven implementations that I've sort of been exposed to have been underpinned by a passionate person where the light bulb has gone on and they're the driver for this. So identify those champions, get them well trained up, empower them, and support them in this, and you'll see a huge change within your organization.
Those are great insights.
I remember young Stephen Montgomery down in South Africa being that kind of champion. It was always a pleasure to see what you did in your company, Steve. It was really remarkable. Yeah. It was even enough to keep me awake after being terribly jet lagged from down there. But the champions, I think you're really correct. It's true.
So On that note, maybe this question could be to both of you. Carol, you first. What kind of productivity improvements do you generally see when DDMRP is adopted as a core planning process?
And again, this is just the start of DDMRP. There's a lot that happens as you get further down the demand road, but just in step one, as companies embrace DDMRP, typically inventories go down about a third to a half. Typically on time and full goes up to about 100%. It is not uncommon to see lead times being reduced from 60 to 90%. There was an aerospace company that some of their lead times came down less than 95, more than 95% in lead time. So these are really dramatic shifts in the operating performance, was what set up the chain reaction. Because now, under demand driven, you're only using your resources to build those things that somebody actually wants to buy. So it frees up capacity. It's always an interesting conversation when I go into a company and they say, oh, but Carol, you don't understand. We're capacity constrained. And then I'll say, well, do you have excess inventory? And they go, oh, yeah, we got excess inventory. Well, then guess what? You've got excess capacity because you had to use the capacity to build the inventory. They go, well, what? I said, so don't do that anymore. Don't do that anymore. Only build what you need and use your capacity to build those things that somebody wants to buy. So not uncommon to see revenues go up. We've seen, as small as 5% to as large as 45% increases in revenue. But typically very, very quickly, and I think maybe Steve can speak to this a little bit because he's got the experience where he worked, is how quickly this happens. This scares people. This is why education is so important. So they know it's coming. And then they go, okay, here it is, we got it. Because when all of a sudden, when the process starts to plummet and inventory starts to come down, and everybody's going, oh no, now what am I going to do? They go, it's okay, it's the way it's supposed to go. So Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Just reiterating that within our implementation, we did 54% inventory reductions. We moved from high 80% service levels to 99.2, 99.3. We were measuring in decimal place levels. And our speed to market was about 600-700% improvement in speed to market. So definitely seen the results, lived the results, and believe in them. I think two other aspects that I think were really insightful for me in the demand-driven implementations I've been a part of. And that's most notable is the improvement in morale. Dejected planners and dejected supply chain people, really good people trying their best, slogging away every day, all of a sudden start to see some light, start to see a change in things. And they literally come alive. Teams start to work together. We get high degrees of collaboration coming together as we go through this. The second aspect is where people think, demand-driven costs are going to go up. And within a very short point, very short period of times, we see the costs coming down, production costs come down, transport costs come down, overtime go down, stock write-offs, we reduced stock write-offs by 74%, for example, and expedite costs plummet. And this net effect with working capital coming down as well as costs coming down leads to a very, very fast and a large cash positive impact. And all of the C-suites really enjoy that.
Absolutely. I think.
And I'd like to add here, this is usually where on a commercial on TV, they put these results are not typical. And what I'd like to add is this is pretty typical result. It's always interesting when we go to a demand-driven world and somebody reports the results, and you'd expect everybody to be up and down cheering, and everybody's like, yeah, that's about right. Because this is really kind of what we think. So good job, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, the closest that one could come to a common sense planning would be like a DDMRP planning. It is kind of very intuitive in nature, so something that any planner would kind of very easily correlate to in their day-to-day planning world. So I think with that thought, I will kind of try to close this session. It's a very insightful first session on DDMRP, and I hope the audience really enjoyed the segment. And Infosys is very proud to bring to you this thought leadership, and we look probably to walk the DDMRP road with you. I will leave you with one thought from a very famous poet by the name Robert Frost. So what he mentioned was two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that made all the difference. And maybe this difference could potentially be your competitive advantage.